Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are. How is everybody doing? I hope you're doing incredibly well, and loads of love to each and every one of you. And I hope you're also keeping lovely and warm, and it doesn't matter what time of the day it is, whether it's morning, noon or night. I'm quite sure you could do with a lovely hot cup of cocoa or coffee or tea, because there's nothing better than that to start or to end the day with. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Kingston and I'm the quintessential Ohioan from the Buckeye state of Ohio, where I have lived my entire life and would never ever consider living anywhere else in the entire world, as I'm proud of my state and love living here. Ohio is on the northeastern edge of the Midwest section of the United States, with the Appalachian region covering the eastern part of the state, making up its largest territory, which is incredibly picturesque and rugged, with high hills and plunging valleys. Then there is the smaller bluegrass area to the south, consisting of steep cliffs, deep valleys, sinkholes and ubiquitous natural caves. Finally, the western part of the state is part of the flatter lowlands. I was born in Asheville, but from the age of 10 years old, I was raised on a corn farm on the northeastern quadrant of the state. My father inherited this farm from my grandfather after he chose to move to a small little townhouse in Asheville, shortly after my grandmother died of breast cancer in 2003. I ascertained that my grandfather perceived that running the farm became too arduous and labour-intensive for him. It would seem that after my grandmother's untimely demise, he simply didn't have the heart to work the farm anymore, and reluctantly decided to retire. My dad was raised on this farm with his two sisters, who are now happily married and both living in Asheville with their respective other halves, so he knew the ins and outs of managing a farm. As you can imagine, my father was only too delighted to press on with running this family farm, which my grandfather did not want to sell, as he'd put his heart and soul and invested and expended his life's work, including his blood, sweat and tears in the place. It was totally understandable and unambiguous of him not to want to sell this beloved, beguiling and bewitching place that held a lifetime of precious, ineffaceable memories for him. My father knew that the farm was a good income earner, as the corn crop was indeed sizable. And so it was in 2003, my family, which consisted of me and both my younger sisters, Hattie and Jennifer, moved from our mundane, rather mediocre city lives in Asheville to the stunning red-bricked farmhouse with the large white sash windows and the stylish front door that had previously belonged to both of my grandparents. I assure you it would not have looked out of place in the English countryside. It had that quintessential old-world whimsical charm about it, and an abundance of character so typically found in historic homes. It's almost as if bygone generations that had come and gone had left behind their indelible mark or blueprint on the place, and even though they had long since passed on, I believe an essence of them still remains. On one occasion, my grandfather actually told me that he had woken up during the night in the autumn of 1973 to see a young 1800s girl running across the verdant lawn and just vanishing before his very eyes. So there is without a doubt an energy to our home that is incredibly tangible. Of course, no one ever got to see the little girl again, but we do believe she lived in the house once and died of pneumonia in the 1800s, according to the historic records. I think I must have been about 10 when we moved into this exquisite home, which was in such pristine condition it didn't require any remodelling, thanks to my grandmother, who kept things in immaculate pristine condition and ensured that the house was always kept updated. The house possessed a gorgeous wraparound wooden deck that overlooked an exquisite silvery pond and was surrounded by undulating verdant valleys, ubiquitous clusters of trees, natural sylvan, acres of farmland and pretty prairies filled with wild flowers. As kids, we were over the moon to move to the countryside, and we were enraptured and enthused by the incredible space where we could go exploring, hiking, camping, fishing and mountain biking as often as we liked. As far as my father was concerned, leaving his job in the city to running the farm was a seamless transition. He was an accomplished farmer himself and highly proficient in everything about managing a corn crop. Better still, my mother didn't need any persuading in regards to the spontaneous, rather random move to the countryside, because she'd been raised on a farm herself as a young girl and was eager to leave behind the life of a busy, bustling town. My strange, incredulous story begins when my grandfather came to stay with us one weekend in the summer of 2008. I remember he was walking onto the wooden wrap-around porch with a gin and tonic in his hands, and he wanted to relax and enjoy the breathtaking tangerine-orange sunset that saturated the valley in a vibrant golden haze. He had always enjoyed watching the magnificent sunset with my grandmother in their younger days, and this moment was incredibly nostalgic for him. My grandfather was blindly oblivious to the fact that there were pools of water on the deck, as our golden retriever Juniper had recently, unbeknown to all of us, taken a leisurely dip into the pond and was lying on the wooden deck to dry off. Juniper has always successfully brought the whole pond with him in that shaggy long coat of his, as pools of water literally enveloped the entire patio. As a result, my grandfather slipped on one of those puddles and lost his balance, breaking his femur quite severely. Naturally, he was rushed to hospital and underwent a lengthy surgery, and my parents insisted he recuperated back at the farmhouse where they could take care of him while he recovered. My parents felt guilty about the accident and somewhat responsible for what had happened to my grandfather. Needless to say, Juniper received a big telling off and was relegated to the dog box for a couple of days, which meant he wasn't allowed to swim in the pond for a while. But believe me, that did not last long, because a day or so later he was chasing frogs and swimming in that pond all over again, oblivious to the chaos he had recently caused. We ended up putting a sign on the wooden deck saying, "Danger, wet dog, slippery surface." I think my sisters and I really appreciated and enjoyed having our grandfather around at home, as he was always a good companion for all of us, watching television, playing cards with us, or telling us incredible stories about his life when he was a young boy. At this time of my life, I was about 15 years old and had become passionate about the subject of Bigfoot and would tune in to all the programs that I could find about the subject on television. My sisters thought my fascination with the critter was stupid and ridiculed me relentlessly for my keen interest in him. They emphatically believed that Bigfoot was as fictitious as the Tooth Fairy, and I was eager to prove them wrong. I would spend copious amounts of time in the wood green on our land, looking for any sign of Bigfoot activity, but it was to no avail, and I was very disappointed. I never found any footprints or any other signs that would point to a Bigfoot being present on our land, which did of course discourage me to a degree, but I was still an ardent, very firm believer in the subject. One day I introduced my grandfather to a Bigfoot program on television, and I was surprised that he appeared rather interested, and I asked him in a nonchalant way, "Pops, do you think Bigfoot is real?" Pops went quiet for a moment, looked really rather hesitant, as if he was wrestling as to whether he should let me in on a secret or not. He fiddled with his moustache awkwardly and said, "Of course they're real, son. I don't doubt that for a moment." I sensed my grandfather knew more than he was saying, and my heart began to flutter with excitement. I knew I had to tread very carefully, as my grandfather had the ability to clam up tightly rather like a mussel in a shell. I thought quickly on my feet. How could I get him to spill his secret? I knew it would require some artful manipulation and guileful techniques on my part, as my grandfather was not a big talker at the very best of times, and getting him to spill his beans was pretty much like extracting blood from a stone. "Nope," I said, cunningly. "They're not real, Pops. All this stuff is just made-up nonsense. Everybody knows that." "It's not made up," said my grandfather, getting his feathers all ruffled up, in a rather defensive mode. "These critters are real. I've seen them myself." "You're making that up, Pops," I teased. My grandfather grew indignant, and I knew my technique had worked famously. My grandfather piped, "I'm telling you, son, we had trouble with these things on our farm before your father was born." And this was the story he revealed to me in his own words. I thought he was going to say that he'd seen a critter crossing his path one day while out in a cornfield or something. You know, the brief random sighting that most people tend to report. I was not prepared for the incredible story he was about to share with me, which was beyond anything I could have ever anticipated, dreamed of, or even foreseen. Without a shadow of a doubt, it knocked my socks off, as I hope it does yours. I want to assure you, my grandfather is the most down-to-earth person in the entire world, and is not inclined to make up fictitious stories, so I know what he has told me is the truth. This is his story. It all began in 1951, said my grandfather. I remember the day as if it was yesterday. I had an extensive vegetable bed at the time that I was exceedingly proud of in the backyard, which I tended to daily. I grew tomatoes, zucchini, bell peppers, cauliflower, cabbage, parsnips, cucumbers, strawberries there. You name it, and I probably grew it. I'd also been growing some phenomenal, very sizable, sweet, delicious, juicy watermelons, and they were my pride and joy. Some of them were like monstrous giants. They were that big. I began to notice that a handful of them had mysteriously disappeared, and I don't mind telling you that I was perturbed by this enigmatic matter, because I didn't know how an excessive watermelon could go walkabout like this, unless someone was deliberately pilfering them. I don't mind telling you that I was protective over my crop, and disappointed in the strange disappearance of these sizable natural treasures. It was on a Sunday morning and an exquisitely warm summer's day. Your grandmother was in the kitchen making her scrumptious apple pie, and the whole kitchen smelt of cinnamon and apples. I was looking so forward to a piece of her delicious pie, so to kill time I just meandered casually into the backyard to look over my vegetable garden, rather like a proud parent watching its babies grow. That was when I saw what I can only describe as a massive critter squatting down on its powerful legs in my vegetable patch, where I grow my treasured watermelons. I noticed its colossal, powerful, muscular back was turned away from me. I remember thinking, what the heck? I couldn't fathom what I was observing, and my first thought was it had to be a bear. I mean, what else could it possibly be? It was covered in very long, flowing hair, but it wasn't the colour of a black bear. It was more like a mixture of colours, like blacks, blondes, reds and browns. It was an unusual, attractive colour, not normally seen or found in bears. I still thought it had to be a bear, as I am used to oddities in nature, having been a farmer, of course. I could hear the critter was gobbling or crunching, and I knew he was tucking into my watermelon, and I was fuming. I raced back into the house, grabbing my rifle and firing some random shots at the critter. The critter got up, standing on his 2 feet, and I nearly fainted in shock. I could not believe what I was discerning. The critter was no bear. But what was it? It looked like a mixture of a man and an ape, and it was about 7 foot tall, 500 pounds, and 3 feet wide across the shoulders. I remember it was eating the watermelon much like an apple, and looked over at me in bewildered surprise after I'd fired some shots at him. And then it just took off like greased lightning with such grace. I've never seen anything move that fast in my entire life. This critter moved like the wind, with the watermelon still clasped in his hand, and he glanced back fleetingly to my direction, and then disappeared into the woodgrove. Are you sure it was a Bigfoot? Well, at the time I had no idea what the critter was, but I assure you, now I know it was a Bigfoot. No question about it in my mind. It had the cone-shaped head, overlong arms, and powerful lofty body. As you can imagine, I informed your grandmother about what I had beheld eating watermelon in our vegetable patch. She wasn't best pleased with me shooting after the critter, as your grandmother just loved animals. I think she thought I'd chased away a bear, because it was difficult for her to comprehend that I'd encountered a hairy man that looked rather like an ape. What did you do that for? She complained. Why did you not let the critter enjoy the watermelon, for goodness sake? Why do you have to be so possessive over that wretched vegetable patch of yours? We won't be able to eat all those watermelons ourselves, so why are you being so cantankerous, grouchy and difficult? Your grandmother let out an exasperated sigh and said, I just don't understand you at times. It's hardly a wonder my hair's turned grey. It turned out your grandmother was absolutely right, as she invariably always was. It was the worst thing I could have done shooting after that Bigfoot, because it came back to bite me hard, in more ways than I could ever imagine. What do you mean? I asked, looking surprised. Well, that very night at the witching hour, when everything became hauntingly still, and there were no sounds of crickets or frogs, nor the occasional hoot of an owl or a howling coyote, all hell broke loose. much like the sound of thunder vibrating through a calm sky. At first it began with these very loud, raucous, high-pitched screams that reverberated from every part of the valley, from the north, the east, the south and the west, and they sounded like multiple women being murdered all at once. Your poor grandmother was so startled and terrified out of her skin and began to sob. The noise was so ear-piercingly loud that it just went right through you. I remember that it was so creepy that it sent spooky, insidious chills down my spine and caused the hair on my neck to stand on edge. We could hear thundering feet that sounded like a herd of trampeding elephants racing around our home over and over again in circles to intimidate and scare us. The next thing I knew was that large rocks were being flung at the house, and one or two of them went right through the window, shattering the glass pane, leaving shards of spiky glass everywhere. It felt like we were under siege. Your poor grandmother was in a dreadful state and began to scream. I truly did not know what on earth to do. I went to the top floor of our home and looked down and realised that there were 3 of these critters. You would have thought, judging by the raging, thunderous commotion they were making, that there were hundreds of these ruddy things, but there was only 3 of them. I could tell the critters were incredibly angry and incensed. They were lashing out with the stones, and so I reached for a high-caliber rifle and shot one of the critters dead. I remember it fell back to the ground and died instantly. The other 2 screamed out in absolute horror. One went running towards the dead critter and was shaking his fists angry at me towards the upstairs window. I could tell she was a female. I ended up shooting her as well, and then the other one dead. I figured it was the 3 of them or the 2 of us, because I knew that those things would take me out now that I'd killed one of their family members. They did not look like they would forgive very easily. The next thing I knew was that your grandmother was sobbing inconsolably and was beating me with her fists all over my body and screaming, "Murderer! Murderer! Murderer! How could you kill them? You're a murderer! This is all your fault!" I remember your grandmother wept and wept because she said the critters were so human. She told me if I hadn't shot after the critter with the watermelon, none of this would have happened in the first place, and she kept telling me she hated me for being such an insensitive person. "What did you do with the bodies?" I asked. "Well, I buried them in the backyard, and let me tell you the size of these things were absolutely unbelievable. I had to get your grandmother to help me drag them along the grass to the grave, and she was far from willing to help me, but in the end she reluctantly agreed. They weighed an absolute ton. Your grandmother went to town and brought the most extravagant bouquets of exquisite flowers for their graves. Normally I would have protested about the lavish expense, but the look on your grandmother's face scared the living daylights out of me. It was like, 'If you dare mess with me, you're dead' kind of look on her face. I've never seen your grandmother more enraged. She was so incensed with me. She made me feel like I was a murderer, like Ted Bundy or someone like that. The look she gave me, whew, they even haunt me today. Well, she insisted on us performing a lavish ceremony with church music and prayers for the creatures, which I thought was way over the top. But with your grandmother in the mood that she was in, I would have walked on hot coals to appease her." "Wow, what a story," I said. "It doesn't end there, son. There is more to this outlandish tale of mine. Hold on tight, because it gets more incredulous every single minute." "There's more?" I gasped. "Oh, yes, there's more. You better believe it. There's more." The following morning I woke up to find my wife in the kitchen feeding a 2-foot-tall Bigfoot. "Now that's going too far," I said. "You expect me to believe that, Pops?" "Believe what you want, son. That's what I saw." "Go on," I said. "What happened?" "Well, your grandmother began waving her finger at me and said that if I hurt this little thing that she had found on the doorstep, we would be heading for the divorce courts any time soon. I knew by the look in her eyes that she meant business." "Where did the little Bigfoot come from?" I asked in amazement. "Well, son, I hate to say this, but I think I might have caused it to become an orphan, as I'd taken out its entire family, and that included its mother. I think it came to our doorstep looking for help, as it was desperate and quite hungry. It was also bright and intelligent. I mean, the thing was helpless. It suddenly made me feel extraordinarily guilty, as this poor thing was lost and alone in the world. What was it like? Well, it was the sweetest thing ever, but very weary of me. It didn't trust me as far as you could throw me, but it loved your grandmother. I've never seen your grandmother happier than she was, looking after that little thing. It would make these cute little noises, and it was a natural comic. It always made you laugh. Your grandmother brought it wooden blocks to play with, and it would sit on the floor for hours building things. It was incredibly creative. Your grandmother brought paints and crayons, and they would scribble together on large white pieces of art paper. I remember he loved smothering his hands in blue paint and painting even the walls with his handprints, and even on your grandmother's dress. We had recently painted the kitchen wall, but I knew better than to say anything to your grandmother for fear of having my head bitten off by her. What kind of things did he eat? I asked curiously. Well, the creature had its preferences. He seemed to like oatmeal with honey and blueberries for breakfast. For lunch, he'd happily eat brown bread sandwiches with peanut butter and jelly. And for dinner, he enjoyed eating a steak, but usually raw, with baked potato and salad. He loved fresh fruit for pudding, especially grapes. He really loved grapes. Did he smell funny? I asked. They always say that Bigfoot stink. What a strange thing to ask, said my grandfather, looking indignant. He smelt just fine, let me tell you. How long did he stay with you? I wish I could say that he stayed long, but he was only with us for about 4 or 5 days. He never slept in the bed that your grandmother prepared for him. He would insist on lying in the dog bed, cuddling up to our red setter, who seemed to enjoy the companionship. I think the little critter had probably cuddled up to his mother this way. It was really cute to see the dog and the Bigfoot cuddled up together. He always lay in a fetal position with his overlong arms around the setter's middle. I think after that critter left, poor little Lacey, who was the red setter, missed him a great deal. Makes sense, I said. How did he leave your home in the end? Well, it must have been on the 4th or 5th day in the evening when there was a loud slapping at the kitchen door. Your grandmother opened it, and standing there was a female Bigfoot. Your grandmother was absolutely amazed. The female critter seemed reticent and terribly shy, almost as if it had taken all her nerve and steely courage to actually approach the door. But amazingly she held her ground, and even looked in your grandmother's eyes, with a deep-set pair of brown eyes. Your gran said her eyes seemed very kind. We never got the impression that this was the little Bigfoot's mother, but possibly a distant family member. She was much more red in colour than the Bigfoots I'd shot, whose coats were multicoloured, with reds, browns and blondes. Your grandmother knew what she wanted, and so she took the little Bigfoot and handed it over to the female, and watched it climb on her back like a tree into a piggyback style, and they just glided away together. I did get the sense that the critter knew the female, because it was so happy to see her again, and recognised her at once. How did the female know you had the little Bigfoot? That's what I want to know, I asked. Well, maybe she'd seen your grandmother playing with the little one in the yard, helping her plant seedlings or something, because those things, they seem to know things and sense things that we don't. How did Granny react when the little Bigfoot left? I imagine she must have been so heartbroken to lose the little critter. Well, she did have mixed emotions on the matter. On one hand, she was so happy that the Bigfoot was back with a family member in his natural environment. But on the other hand, she had grown exceedingly attached to the little fellow. I mean, she'd even named the thing. What did she call it? I asked. She called him Sundance, and sometimes shortened his name to Sunny. She told me the name was inspired when the critter was in the sun. He almost seemed to perform a little dance, because he enjoyed being outside with your granny. Did you ever see Sundance again? I asked. No, son, I didn't, and your grandmother blamed me for that. She said that no sensible, self-respecting Bigfoot family would ever be crazy enough to lay down any roots with me around, because I couldn't be trusted. Oh dear, I said, Granny wasn't easy on you. Well, it would seem I redeemed myself when your father was finally born, as your grandmother was head over heels in love with all her children, and so all her maternal attention was lavished on them. But I know she never quite forgave me for killing those Bigfoots. Looking back, I did possibly overreact, but they gave us such a big scare throwing stones at our house like that. I did what I thought needed to be done at the time, right or wrong. I think you were just trying to protect Granny Pops, I said. You were doing the best you could at the time. Thank you, son. I appreciate that. As you can imagine, after my grandfather's incredible story, I did go and search the Sylvan on our land on multiple occasions, but never saw any signs of Bigfoot activity, although here's hoping that one day I will indeed catch a glimpse of the critter. I have a friend who lives on a neighbouring farm who had a Bigfoot sighting recently, and I must say I am so envious of him. He told me he'd woken up to a strange snorting sound in the backyard. It sounded rather like a horse breathing. He said that his 2 dogs that slept in the house were barking non-stop, and he saw the dark shadowy figure of a Bigfoot through the kitchen window that held his gaze for a moment with that red eye shine, and then disappeared like greased lightning. I sometimes wonder, did he see Sundance? I hope he did, and I often wonder if he's still around. I do hope so. So there you are. That's my story. What an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.